Imagine finding a trail of footprints left by a prehistoric group 80,000 years ago. Some prints belong to adults, many belong to children and adolescents. For a moment, the sand preserves a family moving through the world together, but it cannot preserve what they were saying. Was one teenager following instructions? Was another showing off, wandering too far, or silently deciding that the adults were wrong? That is the problem at the heart of this mystery. Defiance does not fossilize. Archaeologists can recover bones, tools, footprints, injuries, and graves, but not an eye roll beside the fire. Still, biology and behavior leave indirect clues. We can ask whether prehistoric humans experienced adolescence, whether young people were drawn toward peers and danger, and whether ancient societies gave them reasons to challenge authority. Near the end, we will reach the darker possibility. What looks like teenage rebellion may have been dangerous, but eliminating it completely could have been even more dangerous for the group. First, we need to define rebellion. Rebellion is not one emotion or a special gene that activates on a 13th birthday. It can mean arguing with parents, resisting rules, seeking independence, copying peers, testing limits, choosing an unwanted partner, taking risks, or adopting new ideas that older people distrust. Some of these behaviors are destructive. Others are simply signs that a dependent child is becoming an independent adult. Modern research shows that adolescence is a period of major change in reward, emotion, social attention, and self-control. But the popular explanation is often too simple. You may have heard that teenagers act recklessly because the front of the brain is unfinished until age 25. Brain development does continue into early adulthood, but teenagers are not adults with half-built brains. They can reason, plan, remember rules, and understand danger. The difference often appears in the moment. During adolescence, rewards can feel more powerful, social acceptance becomes unusually important, and new experiences attract attention. Cognitive control is improving, but it must operate inside a changing social world. A teenager deciding calmly alone may behave very differently when friends are watching. In experiments, peer presence can increase adolescent risk-taking. Yet peers can also encourage generosity, courage, learning, and safe choices. So the adolescent brain is not simply defective. It is highly sensitive to information that mattered during the transition into adult life. Who accepts me? What can I do? Where do I belong? Which rules are useful? And which ones can be challenged? And here is the first detail many people overlook. Adolescence is not an invention of modern schools, smartphones, or shopping malls. The word teenager describes a social category shaped by recent history, especially education, labor laws, and delayed economic independence. A prehistoric 15-year-old did not attend high school or ask for the family vehicle. But the biological transition between childhood and adulthood existed long before cities. Researchers recently assessed puberty in 13 adolescents from the European Upper Paleolithic. These individuals lived at different sites in what are now Russia, Czechia, and Italy. For most, puberty had begun by roughly the early teenage years. Development varied from person to person, and some had not reached full biological adulthood until the later teens or early 20s. That does not tell us whether they slammed a cave entrance behind them. It tells us something more fundamental. Their bodies passed through a prolonged period of rapid growth and sexual maturation, much like ours. Human adolescence, with all its physical energy and social uncertainty, is ancient. Why did evolution preserve such an awkward stage? Human beings have unusually long childhoods. We must learn food locations, animal behavior, tool production, social alliances, language, customs, and countless local dangers. A young person cannot remain completely dependent forever, but instant adulthood would also be disastrous. Adolescence creates a bridge. Strength increases. The social world expands. The individual practices making decisions before carrying every adult responsibility. That bridge was probably full of tension. A young hunter might be strong enough to join a difficult pursuit, but not experienced enough to read every sign. A skilled learner might understand the basic method for shaping stone while rejecting an elder's preferred technique. A young person approaching sexual maturity might form relationships that affected alliances between families. Independence was not an abstract psychological goal. It changed who gathered food, who traveled, who married, who defended the camp, and who might leave one group for another. But that is still not the strangest clue. At La Roselle in Normandy, researchers studied 257 Neanderthal footprints dating to around 80,000 years ago. The prints appear to represent a small group of roughly 10 to 13 individuals. Adults were present, but children and adolescents formed most of the group represented by the tracks. Footprints cannot reveal personalities. They do not prove that young Neanderthals were playing, disobeying, working, or exploring without permission. But they destroy the image of prehistoric life as a stage occupied only by serious adult hunters. Young people were physically present in the places where daily life happened. They moved through the same landscapes and activity areas, leaving traces among tools and animal remains. They were not waiting off stage to become human later. Other archaeological evidence suggests that children and adolescents learned difficult technologies. At a number of prehistoric sites, researchers have identified poorly controlled flakes, abandoned cores, and repeated mistakes that may represent inexperienced stone workers. These interpretations must be cautious because even adults can make bad tools, but experimental archaeology shows that expert stone knapping is genuinely difficult. A learner must choose suitable stone, position the core, control the angle and force of each strike, and predict how a fracture will travel through material that may contain hidden flaws. Modern experiments with hand axe production have required many hours of instruction and practice. Motivation, persistence, social support, and self-control all affect success. Now imagine learning that skill when a mistake can cut your hand and every useful tool matters. Prehistoric adolescents were probably not carefree children protected from work until adulthood. Many likely contributed meaningful labor while still learning. They could carry fuel, gather plants, process hides, watch younger children, track animals, make simple tools, and gradually attempt more dangerous tasks. The exact division of work varied across cultures and environments, and archaeology cannot assign a universal job description to a 14-year-old. However, responsibility does not erase adolescence. It may intensify it. A competent young person has evidence that they can act independently. An experienced adult has evidence that confidence can be fatal. That is a perfect recipe for conflict. The adolescent sees a new route across the valley. The elder remembers the flood that came 20 years earlier. The adolescent wants to approach another camp. The elder remembers an old feud. Both may have reasonable information, but they value the unknown differently. This is where rebellion becomes difficult to separate from innovation. Every tradition was once a new behavior. Someone first tried a different stone source, a new hunting path, an unfamiliar ornament, or another way to attach a point to a shaft. We cannot assume that adolescents invented prehistoric technologies. Adults innovate too, and archaeological objects rarely reveal the maker's age. But a life stage marked by exploration, sensitivity to peers, and flexible goals could help spread new practices. Peer influence would not require a modern youth culture. A few young people working, traveling, or practicing together could create their own standards. A risky action might become more attractive if it earned admiration. So might a difficult act of generosity, bravery, or skill. The same social sensitivity that produces foolish competition can also push someone to become an excellent hunter, artist, healer, or craftsperson. The stereotype of constant conflict is also misleading. Not every modern adolescent rebels, and there is no reason to imagine that every prehistoric adolescent did. Parenting, personality, food security, group size, danger, and cultural expectations all shape behavior. In communities where young people gradually joined adult work, the transition may sometimes have been smoother than in societies that separate teenagers from adult roles for many years. Burials provide another cautious clue. Studies of European Upper Paleolithic adolescents show that young people could receive ornaments, ochre, tools, and other grave treatment connecting them to wider social traditions. Some differences appeared with age, diet, or individual identity, but adolescents were not simply buried as invisible, unfinished adults. Communities recognize them as socially meaningful people. Yet a grave cannot tell us whether that person obeyed in life. Everything becomes truly frightening when youthful exploration reaches the edge of survival. A modern teenager can make a dangerous decision near roads, substances, or machinery. A prehistoric adolescent faced cliffs, rivers, predators, sharp tools, fire, violence, infection, and severe weather. There was no emergency department after a hunting accident. A broken leg far from camp could become a death sentence. A moment of showing off near a large animal could injure several people. Not only the person taking the risk, sexual maturity created other dangers. Relationships could produce jealousy, social conflict, pregnancy, and obligations between groups. One study of Gravettian burials tentatively noted that patterns of adolescent deaths might include risks connected with early pregnancy, but the evidence is limited and cannot prove individual causes. What is clear is that crossing into reproductive life carried consequences far beyond personal freedom. So why would natural selection tolerate a period associated with novelty and risk? Because refusing every risk has costs too. A group that never explores may fail to locate water during drought. A young person who never leaves familiar people may form fewer alliances. A learner who never questions a method may preserve an inefficient technique forever. When environments change, strict obedience can become a trap. Exploration gathers information. Social experimentation builds networks. Limited conflict helps young people practice negotiation before adult decisions become unavoidable. This does not mean dangerous rebellion was secretly good. Excessive impulsivity can kill, and prehistoric communities probably used supervision, teaching, stories, ridicule, ritual, punishment, and responsibility to control it. The adaptive value lies not in reckless behavior itself, but in a developmental system that increases independence while the group tries to keep the cost survivable. And that leads to the final reversal. Prehistoric teenagers may have challenged adults for the same broad reason modern teenagers do. They were moving from a world organized by caregivers into a wider world organized by peers, partners, skills, status, and personal choices. But rebellion may not have looked like refusing chores. It could have appeared as hunting too soon, copying friends, questioning a technique, choosing a partner, traveling farther, decorating the body differently, or insisting on being treated as capable. We cannot prove any particular argument beside a Paleolithic fire. The honest answer is that archaeology has not preserved rebellious behavior itself. Yet prehistoric adolescents possessed the biology, growing competence, social sensitivity, and changing responsibilities that can produce conflict between generations. They were not miniature adults, and they were not modern teenagers wearing animal hides. They occupied their own dangerous bridge between dependence and authority. Perhaps the footprints at La Roselle preserve the best final image. Young people moved among adults across unstable ground, sometimes stepping inside older tracks and sometimes making paths of their own. Tens of thousands of years later, that is still what adolescence looks like.